Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn. Improve data interoperability in your next decentralized clinical trials. Our presenters for today are Sina Adibi and Sam Dranoff. Welcome and take it away.
All right, Malcolm, thank you very much. And welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today and sharing part of your morning and early afternoon with us. As we bring 2021 to a close, we want to share with you today some of our learnings about our partners' challenges and triumphs with respect to decentralized clinical trials. If the pandemic taught us one thing this past year, it was that our traditional approach to clinical trials must change. And based on my observations over the last 12 months, I can safely say that our industry got that message. But many with whom I talk still have a lot of questions about the how and the what. But before we dive into that today, let me quickly introduce our two speakers here today. First, we have Sina Adibi, who is the founder, president, and CEO of Adaptive Clinical Systems. Sina has over 25 years experience in life sciences informatics. He started Adaptive Clinical Systems with his team and developed the Adaptive eClinical Bus, which is an elegant solution for clinical data integration. Sina was Chief Technology Officer at ParExcel and created many of their eClinical technologies. But what is special about Sina, and I'm sure you'll see today, is that he understands where we've come from and where eClinical data technologies are heading, and then also some of the best ways to get there. And I'm Sam Dranoff, Senior VP of Business Development here at Adaptive. I've worked in late-stage clinical drug development for 20-something years on many sides of eClinical strategy and adoption. I've worked with companies including WCG Clinical, Medidata, Covance, and even helped to start Biomedical Systems Imaging. Over the next 30 to 45 minutes, we'll share both commercial and technical perspectives on issues, challenges, and solutions for planning and executing interoperable data in a distributed clinical trial. So let's begin, Malcolm, with our first polling question, and it's an easy one. So take it away, Malcolm. There we go.
Our first question is, what type of organization are you with? Please select one of the following, and we'll give all attendees 10 seconds to reply. Wonderful. We'll close the poll now and show the results. In response to the question, what type of organizations are you with? 67% responded as CRO and 33% responded as clinical technology data provider.
Right, well, thank you very much for those responses. That's a pretty interesting response. And, you know, for the CROs, it's challenging on how you work to interoperate all of those data streams together. So hopefully we can get into that a little bit. So thank you, Malcolm. And let's move on. And so today we're going to address 4 topics around DCT with you. The first is the role of the patient and new DCT technologies, managing a diverse eClinical ecosystem, remote patient monitoring and medical device integration, and transforming study data management. All right, let's go on. And our first topic in that list is, next slide, please, is, thank you, the role of the patient in DCT and implementing technologies where the patient is the source. So recruitment is the largest leading indicator of study progress. And how well an organization adapts to remote patient recruitment and retention in a post-COVID world is a leading indicator of how their studies will perform. So we've got another polling question for you now. How well do you think your company is doing with respect to recruiting and retention?
I posted the quick poll for all attendees. I'll give you 5 more seconds to reply. All right, that sounds about right.
Okay.
When looking at the results, it shows good, but could be better, as 100% of the response to are your methods of recruiting suited to remote patient recruitment and retention in the DCT world.
Well, you know what? I'm actually encouraged to see that. I would have been maybe a little surprised if anyone thought it was excellent and everything was working well. And I also would have been maybe a little disappointed if no one had really been able to meet any goals and get moving in making the adapting that needs to be done. So that's a good response. So, you know, when we talk about the role of patients in DCT and recruitment and retention, we recognize that it's always been difficult. And now DCT has challenged us to adapt our approaches and to find better ways to find and recruit and manage these patients. So again, let me admit right off that recruitment has always been challenging, but now the diseases that we're trying to address have become more rare, and correspondingly, the cures that we develop have become more complex. Searching for treatment-naive patients has driven us abroad, and that adds more complications, including standardizing and unifying many disparate data formats and dictionaries. We have extensive inclusion and exclusion criteria, and that helps to drive us into a needle in the haystack recruitment scenario. Some of our more advanced and promising responses to these challenges now include utilizing EHR, for example. We're using claims data in recruiting. And of course, this too leads to increasing reliance on technology. So Sina, let me ask you, over this past year, what are some of the data interoperability challenges that you've seen with respect to the patient is the source?
Thank you, Sam. And let me begin by thanking everybody for attending our year-end webinar. And good morning and good afternoon to many of you. We have folks from all over the place. This certainly has been a very, very interesting and challenging year for the technologists in every one of our respective organizations, regardless of whether you're a CRO, a sponsor, or a software development house. Emphasis on technology has become very, very important, specifically as it relates to patients in DCT. The challenge falls into 2 broad categories. One is, how do you leverage technology to find the patient? And this is your example of needle in a haystack. I would say the globalization and the needle in a haystack were kind of trends that were happening, and we had to, as technologists, address that. But the remote data collection piece and really retention of the patients has become exponentially difficult with distributed clinical trials. And then once you find the patient, how do you get the data? How do you get it in a way that is usable to you? So what I'd like to do is I'd like to share the results of a case study that was done by Optum in collaboration with Adaptive Clinical. And I just want to point out a number of things that we all collectively discovered here. By the way, this is a published paper by Optum. If you're interested in reading the details of their discoveries and their findings, we can send you the link. You can go to their website and download it. It's a bona fide study. It was fully vetted, validated, and inspected by the FDA. I'm sorry. So Optum Digital Research Network is a subdivision of Optum General, and they have literally a database of millions of patients. So that's what you see here, which is the Optum EHR data. So, you know, at first blush, we look at this and we say, well, if Optum already has all the EHR data, then what's all of the rest of this that we have to deal with in order to have this final submission-ready data output. So let me walk you through this. The biggest thing that they did very well was how to find the patient. So imagine a world where in the past we used to rely on the PI to find the majority of the patients for us. In fact, back in the day when we were running things at the CRO that I worked with, really that we had a collection of PIs at major hospital chains, and they were the ones that had access to this vast pool of patients. But they were geographically contained, they were tended to be regional. And now what you might do is you might end up finding 2 patients here, 2 patients in the Midwest, 2 patients out in Australia. You want to be able to have and find all of those. So the search for the EHR data is something that was used very effectively here. And it was an iterative process, meaning that they came up with a set of inclusion criteria, they found an exclusion criteria, they found out that there was too many left out or too many were coming in. And that process was sort of iterated through, and they finally found the patients. Now you've had the challenge. Now, if you look here, there is now ePro data that we wanted to collect. There was the e-consent information. Now, these are tools that I'll talk a little bit more about that have joined our repertoire. They were optional not too long ago, but with DCT, these are now required. And of course, the goal of this exercise was how do we leverage data from the EHR? Because the idea of having the CRA or the PI enter the data was not something that was going to be scalable in such a large pool of patients that were so fragmented all over the place. So the information that was collected from the EHRs had to be aggregated, harmonized, and this was a major effort. There is a lot of data in an EHR, but not all of it is geared towards clinical trials. For the most part, that data is dealing with procedures that were executed and provision of care and ultimately billing. Things like under what conditions was data captured and the frequency of the visits and that sort of stuff, which are really paramount for us, are oftentimes things that have to be found in an EHR record. So this pre-processing piece is really critical. I'll give you a real example, which is almost funny now, is one of the sites captured the patient's weight in ounces. So here you have a situation where something as basic as the patient weight required some attention and programmatic normalization and harmonization. So it's things like that. Because don't forget, when we prepared our data management plan and our site training manual, we used to give that to the CRA and the PI, and they would read it, and they were actually mentally doing this harmonization for us. Now, this is something that is a physical act that we have to now do. Then you take that, and how do you now merge that data with a patient having an ID that's proprietary to that hospital with the patient ID that comes in from the ePro? So that's a whole other challenge that has to be solved in a multi-vendor, meaning multi-technology environment where studies and patients are dispersed. And finally, of course, the FDA requires us to use EDCs and ETMFs. So that data now needs to be packaged in formats that they're accustomed to seeing. Now, some of the other things that you have to do is planning on how to collect this data. And now that's something that is very, very important, is that it's just because they have EHR at the site and it's an EHR brand that you recognize, you doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be very easy for you to get that information. So you want to make sure you allow plenty of time for planning of the data flow for the patient selection, and then I'll talk a little bit more about these technologies and how can you bring them together. Okay.
All right.
Go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Sina. That's some really good insight. Thank you. All right, so now let's move on to our next adaptive clinical learning in 2021, and that's around the challenges of managing the eClinical ecosystem. So when I started in this industry some years ago, there were a few dozen eClinical vendors all told. And this year I browsed through the DIA conference exhibit floor exhibitors, and there were 60 or so EDC vendors alone. The stakeholders that I speak with now are looking to incorporate a plethora of tools beyond EDC, things like CTMS and eSource and ePro and eCOA, analytics, site solutions, I mean, so many now. And all of these tools are accessible in combinations of sophistication and bundling with other capabilities. So for example, sponsors may choose a unified platform for study conduct, and then simultaneously, they may support a centralized core capability using one-off best-of-breed technologies and services. So clearly, all of these add value and perform important functions. And in a perfect world, they also interoperate data from multiple data centers and data lakes. But change isn't easy, and our clients tell us that using all of this data and harmonizing and integrating all of this data is quite challenging. So Sina, a question to you. How does one manage all this diversity from all of these different data sources and perspectives?
Sure. Well, this is quite a challenge. This is a diagram that we borrowed, obviously, with attribution to a research paper by Gartner. And the Gartner analyst who wrote this paper did a very exhaustive survey of all the tools that were brought to bear in a clinical trial. What's interesting here, as an anecdote, this is a 2019 paper that was aimed for ClinOps and CIOs of pharma. And I bet you that when they update this paper now, there's going to be, in addition to the familiar acronyms that are EDC, CTMS, you will find telemedicine and EHR, EMRs that are technologies that were developed outside of our universe. But, you know, we started with, our world used to be very simple. FDA came to us once and said, look, you know, we want your data to be all captured in nice CRFs and in an EDC format. CDISC did a really good job of proposing standards, and then we adhere to that. So we kind of started life with EDCs that were central to everything we did. And then clinical trial management tools were glorified project management tools that were really a luxury that only major pharma could afford. In fact, a lot of CROs even had their own versions of it, but, and you know who you are, we all used Excel. And we had little grids, and we would check off things like patient recruitment and so on. And then as our world progressed, we realized that we're entering data twice. For example, a lot of EDCs out of necessity incorporated things like, okay, the procedures during the course of an event, and the timing of the event, was the event scheduled, not scheduled, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, they captured the case report form clinical data as well. We were entering the data twice. We were entering it once in the EDC and another time in the CTMS. So after a while, we kind of had this awakening that, listen, there's got to be a better way, right? You know, why not enter it once in the CTMS and have the pertinent pieces pushed to the EDC and then to the RTSM? Now, this is going to be of note to the majority CROs who are in attendance. The CRO world, you know, we wish we could standardize on a single EDC or a CTMS. We're oftentimes driven by what the sponsor wants. So what happened was we as CROs would find ourselves as having multiple EDCs, multiple CTMSs, and this interconnectivity, what we call point-to-point connection, was something that would become very, very unwieldy. And moreover, we were kind of transforming from being organizations, contract research outsourcing organizations with clinical know-how to ones that had to have an IT powerhouse, which was non-core to us. What Gartner is proposing is Gartner is basically saying you really can't live in these two worlds. And what they're saying is your options are twofold. One is either get those separate tools, go pick the best in breed, the ones that you really like, maybe you have history with and you know don't require training, or ones that the sponsor tells you to, and then interconnect them in a uniform way using a interoperability platform. And in fact, in this particular paper, as a sort of a perfect example and category, the Gartner folks mention us as well. The other alternative you have is to go with a unified platform. And, you know, those are the mega vendors that we know. And those vendors do have a lot of tools that do tie together very well. Except many of them are kind of growing the portfolio. So what happens in a situation like that, let's say you find an e-consent, or let's say you find a platform that does telemedicine. And this unified platform vendor really has that in their 3-year plan, and this is year 3. But now with DCT, you need to hook up telemedicine. You need to hook up sort of a nurse visit output that is captured on that platform into your CTMS and EDC. So for that reason, the Gartner folks propose that this is the type of approach that will make it a lot better and easier, where you preserve functionality while at the same time you enhance your enterprise enablement. So the challenge or the approach that I really would like to urge everybody to think about is, this is a list of all of the tools. As Sam mentioned, you used to be able to name, you remember that name, Phase Forward, Sam? You know, Phase Forward was key. You know, you pretty much would grab that. Now, everybody has an EDC, and the EDCs are ever so slightly different. Now, there are a lot of CTMSs, which used to be a luxury. Now it's a must-have. With the Healthcare IT Act, we know that all of our patient data is in the EMR and the EHRs. Studies are becoming very, very complicated. So core labs and central labs. So for a typical study, you might end up with 3 or 4. If you're a CRO, you might end up with 3 or 4 different lab feeds. So lab reconciliation definitely has outstripped Excel for sure. So you really need to automate how you reconcile the sample results that are coming back from the labs. And oftentimes these labs have very proprietary feeds, and they have different ways of identifying patients. There are, of course, our biostats groups have always used SAS and SPSS and these analytic platforms, but there is a number of new ones that have emerged. And when you begin to have dashboards and KPIs, there are data vendors such as Clarivate or Informa Sightline that allow you to compare your KPIs, for example, with industry standards. And if you want to, as a CRO, compare yourself to what is a typical performance that I'm getting from my sites and what is the industry performance benchmark for that, you can go to the likes of Clarivate or Sightline to get that information. So we now have data that didn't even originate in our world that we want to bring it in. And I want to touch on the patient monitoring piece of it. With DCT, as we push data collection out to what I call the edge, which is where the patient sits, you now have each patient generating data without mediation. So that mHealth app or that wearable that they have is constantly capturing telemetry, and it needs to be able to feed that through. What you end up with is too much data coming from here, and you need a way to be able to sift through that data so that you can aggregate it, you can sample it, and I'd like to show you a demo of a prototype we did. So something as simple as a cardiac monitoring. You are interested in when there is a large blood pressure fluctuation, for example. You're not necessarily interested in blood pressure where the patient is not moving, and you want to be able to only capture fluctuations that are beyond a certain margin. So you need to have a way, an intelligent engine in the middle that can capture the telemetry, and this feed is often proprietary because these tools were developed in a completely different universe than us. So they don't speak CDISC, they don't speak any of the standards that you would expect to see. And oftentimes they even, in order for you to get data directly from them, they require data processing agreements and data transfer agreements because of the regulations that they have to abide by. So, you know, these are things that we definitely need to incorporate with a DCT. There are easy ways of doing it. It is certainly doable, but it just requires some planning. So I would say that things that I would look for as you're choosing your technology partners, as you're going through this, is look for open APIs. Now, a lot of these tools were developed as monolithic implementations. So they never really were designed to live in a world where they had to collaborate and interact and interoperate with other tools. Many are awakening to that. So a number of our partners are doing that, and in fact, we're helping them with that aspect of it. But that open API should be something that, in my opinion, you should definitely incorporate in your RFP when you're going through your tech selection. Ultimately, really, the goal is free interchange of data in real time between these sources of data into your environment. Ultimately, you're the consumers of that data, and you need to be able to bring that together. Let's go to the next polling question, Sam.
All right, so thank you, Sam. That was really insightful, and I agree with you 100%. There's been a sea change with data science in the last year, and you know, other technologies like AI and ML that we haven't really talked about yet for analytics. All of these new capabilities and data streams and data flows are challenging us, and also challenging our ability to handle change management. So we have a third polling question here, which is, what do you envision to be your most significant challenge in managing eClinical solutions in 2022? And Malcolm, I'll hand this over to you so you can bring that up. Thank you.
Not a problem. The polling question has been posted. We'll give all attendees 5 seconds to complete their answer. Wonderful. I'll close the poll and share the results. So it looks like 100% of the attendees responded as their most significant challenge in managing eClinical solutions in 2022 as planning expertise and organizational readiness.
Wow. You know, this is a tough question to answer, and I would have probably said all of the above, because I think all of these things are things that need to happen parallel with one another. But it's interesting to see this kind of response. Sina, any observations?
Yeah, this is very encouraging, actually, Sam, to me, because everyone is recognizing that this is a completely different approach. I think folks, I'm hoping that the reason that they're talking about planning is because they're recognizing it's something that they haven't done before. So they need to think about it. And then organizational readiness, that is really key. We have actually seen projects where folks forged ahead with implementing interoperability only to realize that different subgroups, operational groups, capture data in very, very different ways. And they had to take a step back and first have an agreement. Okay, this is how we're going to, this is what we mean, for example, with something as trivial as date of birth. So I think this is a layers of onion here, Sam. I think that once folks get some experience with planning expertise and address the organizational piece, then they'll realize that, you know, the other pieces are just as critical. I think this is just the steps in the evolution.
That's a good perspective. Yep. All right. Well, you know, this actually segues into our next discussion topic and also our next polling question. Let's talk about remote patient monitoring and integrating medical devices. This is something, Sina, you started to mention a few minutes ago. The medical device industry and mHealth markets are booming. As DCTs take hold, the era of DaaS, or device as a service, is upon us. We've got the watches, mini ECG readers, wearable glucose monitors, and a lot more. And all of these are part of like a $12 billion medical device market that's growing around 50% annually. So that growth curve will add exponential data that we're going to need to interoperate into our clinical trial workflows. And medical devices are quite different from the technologies that we're used to working with. So again, Sina, back to you. What are some of the challenges and opportunities we've seen in 2021 for incorporating medical devices and data interoperability?
Sure. I think it's you know, I'm always a sort of a glass half full kind of guy. What I've been really excited about in the last year or so with DCT is that a lot of med device vendors that used to consider hospitals as their primary target market are now beginning to realize applications of their wares in our space. I think that's really important, right? You know, there needs to be a desire on our part and then a willingness on the vendor's part to kind of incorporate capabilities that we require in their devices. The half empty part of it is that a lot of these device vendors have very well established product suites, and they are kind of looking to modify and morph it for our use. So as I said before, you know, a typical bedside monitoring device, and I'd like to show you a use case implementation that we did, but a typical bedside monitoring device such as this one from Massimo, you saw Massimo on the list of partners, is one where really the goal was monitoring, pushing the telemetry to the nurse's station, generating alerts when there are deviations, and do sort of periodic procedures. Really was not designed for a programmed way of sampling the data, not because it was ill-designed, it really was because it just was not something that was in the ask. So now, here we have Massimo, for example, is the largest bedside monitoring tools vendor, just about every site or hospital that you go to, I encourage you to ask. I assure you they're going to have these Masimo devices. So they have a whole suite of devices. They're pretty well established. Now, our challenge is is there an easy way for us to get the data? And that's really what was the use case that we tried here. So this is a screen recording that I have. And the reason that we're doing this as a screen recording is because having the device handy for this webinar would not have been practical. But you've got the full feature set of these devices. So as you're considering direct data capture from, or remote patient monitoring is the term that we use, think about tools that have the capabilities that you want. Now, there are different vendors are at different levels of maturity. So, for example, there are larger vendors that can take care of the provisioning, distribution, and collection of the data. Then there are brand new vendors that really just got their 510K approval on their device, and they're very happy. I'm going to pause here for a minute. And they're very happy to give you the device or ship a box of these devices to you. But how do you get it to the patient? How do you provision it? And what I mean by that is the patient has to know how to use it. So make sure you choose a tool that is either already there or is very, very easy to use. Okay, so imagine a patient that wakes up in the morning and has to get, let's say, their the litmus strips ready as they walk into the bathroom. They have to log into their app on their mobile, and then they have to turn on a device and they have to install the device and attach it to themselves. Very, very complicated. The retention is going to go right down. Now, a lot of folks are looking at what we call hybrid studies, where a nurse actually visits, does the setup, delivers the tools, sets up the patient. If there's any training, they do that training for them. And then they periodically, they come in just to make sure if the data is not coming properly. So the use case that we prototyped here was the tool is already provisioned, it's at bedside, it's attached to the patient, and it's capturing the blood pressure. And the study protocol had certain number of requirements. They were looking for blood pressure outliers, but they were looking for steady sampling as well. But really what they were mostly interested in was the blood pressure outliers, and they wanted to be able to have a steady sampling. So the way this is set up is, remember the open API thing that I mentioned? There are modules here, and these modules are all reusable. So if there's anything that the platform has already worked with, so you have, the Cerner and Epic and so on, which you've seen before already there. And because as a CRO, we tend to repeat when we do our studies in terms of our workflow, it needs to be something where the workflow is easy to design. So here we have the workflow is a very simple one. I'm going to go back real quick. I just want to pause it here just to show you the workflow and the repeat. So the idea here is you capture the data and it comes in raw form. Again, remember, these devices don't know anything about CDISC. What you want is you want to peel off the blood pressure information and process that, and then you want to prep it and then forward it to the EDC. In this case, the EDC vendor that we collaborated with was BioClinica. This is test data, of course. So a couple of things. Patients are anonymized in the EDC, so the tool needed to find a way to map the blinded patient IDs with the actual physical device configuration and serial numbers. So there are some behind the scene prep work and study setup work that took place here. Then finally, the other thing that had to happen was these are the CRFs. We're very familiar with this. This is our world. But then how do you know what to put in there, right? So this is the CRF table, and you have vital signs, very simple. And the data has to come in real time. Again, you know, the patient has this attached to them. This is the proprietary format of the data, nothing that we know. There's a lot of stuff in there. All you're interested in is just peeling off the blood pressure information. And here it is. So we have this thing triggered so that every 5 minutes or so, it grabs a sampling from the blood pressure that is coming from the device. And so here was at 22:02, then 5 minutes later, there was the data that came in. Blood pressure is 120/80. Again, folks, this is not real data, but just to illustrate the challenge. So you kind of need this business of driving the sampling. This came from your protocol, and then it translated to your data management plan that translated to your CRF design. So now you have a tool that is pushing data in real time, and what you're really interested in is filter everything, but really if everything is normal, just capture it every 5 minutes. So now let's, just to make this a little more exciting, let's say now there is an outlier or an anomaly. Now, if we handle this in the traditional way, which is we used to have edit checks in the EDC, that'll be too late, right? Because if you look here, this anomaly happened only 2 minutes after the last sample. So the device is generating all of this telemetry, and you've got the middleware inspecting it and saying, okay, not in the range, not in the range. So some of the edit checks that we used to do post-haste in the EDC have to get pushed up the food chain in the data flow. So some thought needs to be given to what we call the data flow planning and design of capturing DCTs if you want to go direct to the device. So here there was a fluctuation above the range. So now the cadence goes back to every 5 minutes. And now it's looking for a major change in the blood pressure. So now the next 5-minute interval, let's see, okay, so blood pressure didn't change, so we're back to 5 minutes. And again, now let's say the blood pressure now changes back to something else. We now revert back to doing this. So a couple of challenges here, right? One is the way the blood pressure comes through, it needs to be transformed in a way that bioclinical EDC understands it. This whole end-to-end from the device up from the hospital's network in through the cloud back to the middleware, from the middleware to bioclinical EDC, all has to be validated and verified. Because, you know, FDA is very excited about this sort of direct capture. And in fact, they have published guidances on e-source and that sort of stuff. And they do want us to capture data as close to the patient as possible. But they're not giving us a pass on the validation. So you have to make sure that all of this flow and all of these transformations are carefully documented and in FRSs and appropriate people within your organization, since majority of us are CROs, need to be able to sign off on it. For the tech people in the audience, the FDA is going to look for CFR 21 Part 11 compliance. If you're pulling data from electronic medical records and the EHR, they're going to look to see if those EMRs and EHRs have been approved by the HHS. So you can't just set up a conduit to any EMR, EHR that's out there because FDA has basically delegated the the compliance of the EMR EHRs to HHS, that leaves a hole for what do you do with EMR data that's coming from international sites where they're not within HHS's remit. So these are things that, Sam, that's why I was happy that people are thinking about planning and the organizational readiness. You know, it's important for you to know that there are all of these nuances. Privacy is another huge thing. Data that comes from these tools sometimes might have PHI data in the clear. So you need intermediaries that can mask that and isolate the clinical group from any of that information. Something from your old world, Sam, is medical imaging is notorious for having patient information in the MRI, right? Do you remember those days?
Yep, the headers, yep.
So, you know, having that to be able to filter that out. So these are, again, none of this is insurmountable. Hopefully we have tech people in the audience that are nodding as in, okay, yeah, been there, done that. Just plan for it. It's all doable. Don't forget, you do need an intermediary, though. I have not seen this effectively implemented by directly tying the devices to the end system. By the way, if you have any questions or if you would like to see this demo again with other folks in the room, we'll be happy to arrange that. We also have a number of other capabilities that we can show you. Sam, am I back to presenter mode? Do you see my full screen?
Yes, yep.
Okay,
Okay.
good.
There we go. All right, well, thank you. You know, around everyone's comment around planning, I think this is a great example of planning for what I would call intentional interoperability. And, you know, clearly it benefits, you know, the CROs in conducting the study, but also, you know, the sponsors, convenience for the sites, and certainly for the patients as well. So I can't wait to see how mHealth and Devices continues to expand in the next couple of years. So anyway, let's keep moving along, and we've got our final polling question for you. And Malcolm, let me hand this back over to you.
Not a problem. Our fourth polling question says, how will you utilize patient monitoring technologies in 2022 compared to 2021? Feel free to select one, and I'll give the audience 3 more seconds to provide their responses. Okay, we'll close the poll now. And in sharing the results, how will you utilize patient monitoring technologies in 2022 compared to 21? We have 50% at about the same and 50% need to do more.
I think this is spot on and reflects, I think, what I would have expected to see. Just, you know, knowing how DCTs can be better supported using these devices, it makes sense that there would be more in the thoughts of our study planners as they start to, you know, plan decentralized clinical trials. So that makes perfect sense to me. Sina?
Yeah. You know, as I was looking at this thing, I really wish if folks who did responded by about the same. If you could put in chat, how many different devices do you typically use? Is it one? Is it two? Is it multiple? That'd be very interesting data to share with everybody. I'm certainly curious about that. But yeah, you know, need to do more. I think that's one thing that DCTs prove to us is that we really gotta push the data collection to where the patient is.
All right, so let's move to our last topic here for today, which is transforming and expanding uses of study data management. So, you know, DCTs have liberated data generation, and we've got a whole distributed and disparate ecosystem. And that creates numerous challenges for data aggregation and harmonization and integration. At the same time, we're all under pressure to speed better medical treatments to market. And in my experience, and those of you maybe on the webinar that I've worked with, we achieve this through improvement in quality and time and cost. So for example, we could add a new data stream like medical claims data, and that might improve our outcome specificity, but we can't do that at the expense of significant added cost. So we need tools that meet the challenges of DCT that can interoperate all of these data flows and then proactively enable us to raise or eliminate issues early in the study. Well, I was going to say that, just all of these challenges that we have on this poll, they all require data interoperability first. And then after that, having achieved that interoperability, to have the visibility of those data for the intended users of those data. So, my handoff to you, Sina, is with so many disparate data sources out there and how complex and challenging it is, how is it possible to create a data interoperability scenario for all of the stakeholders in a decentralized clinical trial paradigm?
Sure. Yeah, this is obviously something that we have been thinking about quite a bit, and the product platform that we have is about 5 years old. Really, it stemmed from an observation we made that there were many new tools that were coming along. If you have an EDC or experience with multiple EDCs and CTMSs, they all have reporting capabilities by now. If you've been around as long as Sam and I have been, you do know of EDC tools that didn't have reporting capabilities. But perish the thought, that's not the case anymore. However, the challenge that we have is this fragmentation. So there are all of these buckets of data, as I call them. So think in the color codes are the blue. Right, so you have EDC that does a good job of capturing all its data, and it gives you really nice reports, visualization, and CTMS does the same, etc., etc. So one thing that gets CROs dizzy is when, I'm just gonna hypothetically say this is the division of labor. Let's say project managers sit in front of the CTMS and the data managers sit in front of the EDC. PM generates a report that says so many visits were completed. Data management sits in front of the EDC report, and lo and behold, they can't get the numbers to reconcile. They don't have as many CRFs, or the CRFs were incomplete, even though the site marked the CTMS as this CRF was captured, it actually was missing a bunch of vital information. So then we always do this scramble where we have this manual reconciliation going across the thing. So the problem is these discrepancies of reports that are happening. And then our data producers have also expanded in the sense that we now have groups that are dedicated to safety, for example. We have groups that actually do biostats, and then they feed data back in to the things, into the ecosystem. And then you also have like your data sources. We have, and I won't get too much into it, that this is a topic for a future webinar we have scheduled for real world data. How do you use that? How do you set up synthetic arms and that sort of stuff? And then you have operational stats and so on. So this fragmentation is what we felt was important to address. And you heard us talk about interoperability, and interoperability is when you take the data from one source, you massage it, make it consumable by the target, you push it to the target, you do it in real time, regardless of what the tool is. So with that, we kind of had a realization that we're sitting on this common database of all of these sources that would allow our users to very easily organize it, the data. So this is aside, in addition to better data flows, now you can have visibility across all of the studies. You can have visibility. Let's say you have 5 different labs, as I mentioned, that are sending data through to you, and you want to measure the performance and the turnaround time of all of those. Or let's say if you're a large CRO and you have parceled out some work, I'm sorry, a large sponsor, and you have parceled out some of the work to different CROs, and you want to be able to see the throughput. So you want visibility to all of your data at the study level, at the program level, and at the enterprise level. So the realization was that having a common data store was something that would allow people to have that visibility, and interoperability, of course, was something that was important. And then lo and behold, the other thing to consider was we recognized that once you did see some visualization of the data and you want to traverse back to the source, there needs to be an easy way to do that, right? Because once you aggregate the data, sometimes some of the tools vendors, they actually lose what I call the context of the data. In other words, if an outlier came from a CRF for patient X in RAVE, when you see that outlier, you shouldn't have to trace back and look through a third-party tool and sift through reports. You need to be able to just click and pop right back into that source. So retaining that context of where the data came from is something that is key for a data warehouse. It has to be in real time. You saw the example of the med devices, and then of course the metadata that I mentioned. Where did it come from, at what time, so that you can go back and trace the data back, and then it needs to be cross-referenced and harmonized. Simple example was patient weight. The site was capturing it in ounces. I have no idea why, but no one else does that. Now, if you take that and you say, I have an international study, you are now talking about imperial units and kilograms. That can get exponentially more difficult when you take into account clinical things like calculating body mass index, which are different algorithms for, and your data management plan and your protocol has specified those. So those data harmonizations are something that needs to be happening. And really, ultimately, the goal is, of course, having visibility to the data of the data, and then be able to get to the standardization. 3 things I'm asking you to bear in mind when you're doing your tool selection. Of course, visualization, there are a lot of vendors that don't do that really well, but you need a holistic way of doing it. Interoperability is really critical. You can't double data enter anymore. That introduces error, introduces lag, which is going to be really fatal in a situation where, in a distributed study where there is fragmentation, that lag can really drive your study and slow it down. And finally, look for tools that allow you to expedite the workflow. And what I mean by that is, now you have new consumers of data, and those consumers want to see the data. They're not necessarily the traditional groups of data management and ClinOps, but they might be from finance. They want to see, financial reports based on procedures that were done. They shouldn't have to wait until you type in the billing information into the financial system. Sam, I'm doing a time.
We're a little long. I think we have to.
I think what I'd like to invite people to do, I was going to do a quick demo of the adaptive data view, which is our product, but I would like to invite folks to let us know if you're interested. In that demo, I was going to illustrate how you can get lab reconciliation, program level reporting, how you can do a magic click back from an outlier to the actual EDC, regardless of what it is. So I'm sorry I talked too much, Sam, and I
It's all good stuff. It's all good stuff. And then also, because we are running long, we will put in our blog answers to the questions that came in. So, keep a lookout for that. So, Sina, thank you for that. I think, in summary, we recognize that data interoperability is a critical table stakes capability for conducting good decentralized clinical trials. That means using all the data from all the parts of the study in real time and being able to visualize 360-degree views of study status. So, in the last year, we saw data management transform itself into data science. And if data is the lifeblood of a clinical trial, then data interoperability is the pulse that brings that science to life. So at this point, we'll close our webinar for today. We want to thank you all for attending and trust you learned some interesting things about data interoperability in DCTs. As I may have mentioned before, we'll post this webinar on our website should you want to revisit or share it with others. And of course, if you have any other questions that come up, please reach out to me and I'll be happy to get together with you and address it. So we look forward to seeing you again, and thanks again for joining us, and everyone have a great afternoon. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.